and Derek, push back if what I'm saying is wrong. What Republicans are doing is really only working because of the economic and demographic transformation. It's not an ideological shift. They're not becoming more conservative. They're becoming less partisan broadly. And as that happens, and as Republicans lean into populism and Latinos become more populist, Republicans are winning votes despite their best efforts, not because of them, is essentially the argument that I'm making. And is that what you would say is right or wrong?
And Derek, you should feel free to tell him he's wrong.
Please do, because Chuck does all the time.
Sorry, Chuck. No, that is consistent with the findings of my study, which like the Republican pro-business messages are not as effective as a Republican just generically talking about jobs. Republican messages that are moderate on economics are generally slightly more positive than a Democrat doing so.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Latino Vote Podcast, coming to you live from what we're calling Muskville here in what used to be Washington, D.C. Elon Musk is now the mayor, the president, the conqueror of all things. There's a bunch of little 19-year-old white boys walking around with backpacks just taking over one department at a time, but we're still here. I'm still here in my little row house, and we're fighting it every single day. What's going on in your world, Mike Madrid?
Well, I'm in California, which is where we kicked Elon Musk out of successfully. So,
it's your fault.
Yeah, we'll take credit for it. We pushed him out. Don't be scared. We'll show you how to do this. It's not that hard. He's all hat and no cattle, as they say somewhere in Texas. Stole a Chuck Rocha line there. Look, we're dealing with some really significant weather patterns here. Pineapple Express, they're called. It is a huge amount of water that is deluging all at one time. Just days after Donald Trump released a lot of water unilaterally and wasted a gazillion gallons of water that we needed in the summer to prove a point. The point being that he was wrong and does not understand California water policy. So, another day in the life. Things are continuing. I think we're pacing ourselves for a long few years here. But I am excited, by the way, to have a special guest on tap, somebody who is incredibly insightful, been admiring his work for some time. I'm going to let you do some of that introduction, though, Chuck.
And Derek, thanks for coming on. And I know that me and you've had a chance to meet in person, and you can get into what you're doing now at your new job at Bucknell. But for all of you that is listening, Derek is another one of these eggheads, and I mean that with all due respect, like Mike Madrid. He is very well read. He's a professor. He's got the doctorals, the theorals, and all the rural roles. And I'm making that word up, Mike. It's not like Methuselah. We're not going to go down that. We're going to go down that path again. But Derek, welcome to the show. Derek Wakefield from up in Pennsylvania and Bucknell University, right, Derek?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Currently out of Atlanta, but for the future, I'll be in Bucknell, and I'm really excited to be in Pennsylvania for these pivotal next few years.
Tell us how you found out about the podcast and me and Mike Madrid.
Well, so actually, it goes back to this little book called T.O. Bernie.
Now we're getting somewhere. Finally, we're getting somewhere.
I was reading during my dissertation, trying to figure out what's going on with Latino politics. And, I was following Bernie Sanders' primary campaign very closely and noticing that he was receiving just disproportionately high levels of Latino support. I then ended up looking at Chuck's work and book, found it really, really inspiring. And the one quote I'll say that really stood out to me is that Bernie did not have a Latino strategy. Instead, Latinos were in every aspect of his strategy. And so just as an overall moral of today's talk, that's going to be a lot of how Latinos are Americans too. And there shouldn't be necessarily a specific strategy. Instead, the strategies that work for Americans, full stop, also work for Latinos.
For the record, I'm going to interject and take a point of personal privilege.
Jesus Christ.
I want everybody to remember Bernie Sanders' campaign was not the first campaign to do that. It happened 16 years earlier with George W. Bush's campaign in 2000. Thank you very much. We called it the seamless campaign. It's when we had Latinos literally built into every aspect of the campaign. There was no Latino-specific campaign. And it worked. It worked then.
Jesus Christ. But he got this. Let's go back to how great I am in the book. So thank you, Derek. Sorry about that. He interrupts sometimes when I get too much credit for things. Before he gets to ask the next question, tell us a little bit about you and your family. For any of us that are watching, Derek is as pale as Mike Madrid, but he is Latino. And I want him to tell us a little bit about his family and his family's journey here. And then what made you get involved in this work? We're going to talk about your work. We got plenty of time to talk about your work, which is really cool. I've been reading some of it. But tell us about your journey to academia and your family's journey here.
So the journey to academia is actually probably the best way to start this because I actually wasn't always comfortable identifying as Latino, including in my undergrad. And that's sort of a journey I've been on through my higher ed process. And to skip to the end, what I've eventually come to is that, this is an important part of who I am. So my grandmother's family is from El Salvador. My dad grew up there for a significant period of time. There is some trauma associated with that, though, because they actually left because of the Civil War. And so a lot of my story has been understanding how that trauma in many ways made it difficult to have a really deep connection. And so also a lot of what I've been trying to do is to rebuild that, to replenish my attachment to my roots. And academically, a lot of what that manifests as is saying, hey, I have these accreditations, I have this PhD, the whatever it's that Chuck was talking about. I want to use that to then produce research that can better understand a group of people who, I'm part of the community, but I'm definitely a more privileged member, but still I have a job to do. And especially with everything happening recently, that's been my through line, is that given these, both privileges I've been given, but also again, through my own academic inquiries, how can we do things that'll help Americans broadly, but specifically Latinos, to receive a better shake from political campaigns? And so in a way, being in spaces that allows me to mentor Latina and Latino students, working with other colleagues, Latino and otherwise, has really been a way for me to build my own Latino identity and to be more comfortable in claiming that.
Mike? I absolutely love that. I did not know any of that, Derek, but that story sounds so very eerily similar to mine in such a beautiful way. I tell a lot of people I didn't really realize I was Latino until I got to Georgetown in the early 90s, because there were no Latinos at Georgetown. And I realized, wait a second, I'm different. And in the Southwest, when I was growing up, I was like, wait a second, but this need to kind of sort of, in many ways, justify and use hard data and evidence to say, wait a second, my experience is not anomalous here. And through the course of my research, realizing not only is my experience not anomalous, it's the norm. What I'm understanding, the way I grew up, is the way the vast majority of us are growing up. And yet this narrative is being defined in a very different way. And what it did was it forced a stereotype on our community. And if you didn't fit the stereotype, it questioned your Latino identity. And as somebody who grew up so strongly culturally Latino, I was like, wait a second. This takes a little bit further research. And I look back in the same way you've gone to academia to keep finding that data and are doing a hell of a job. We're going to talk about that in just a second. I chose to go in to be a practitioner, to be an actual political consultant, to kind of be involved in campaigns for that same opportunity, for that same rationale, and say, wait a second, we are different, but we're not that different. And what I want to do is explain the nuances as to what it means to be Latino and what it's becoming. And I think 2024 was a real watershed year where people are going to say, wait a second, maybe our stereotype of who we've been trying to say Latinos are, maybe it's not that accurate. And so with that, that's my perspective. But with that in mind, and as a segue, I was hoping you can talk about some of your work, because a lot of what I thought really intrigued me about the academic that you're working was, here was finally an academic who was saying a lot of what Mike Madrid was saying politically. I'm just going to say it. I'll say it, Chuck. I'll take credit.
Damn it.
Yeah. This academic is saying, you know what? Economic issues are a little bit more important than these other racial and ethnic cues. Doesn't mean that they're not important. Doesn't mean that the immigration experience isn't, is something you're either for or against. It can be nuanced. But here is somebody finally saying something that all of the polling for 3 decades has said, which is economics are the top issues for Latinos. So can you walk us through, Derek, a little bit about what your body of research is and how it's a little bit different and unique?
Yeah, so as I was writing my prospectus, I actually presented it to the Princeton politics department, and the title was "Identity Reactivity: How Latino Identity Drives Latino Voting Behavior." It was a proposed experiment. I ran it, and didn't find an effect. In fact, what I found there was that partisanship far and away blew everything else out of the water. So that, is
Shocking.
consistent.
Yeah.
Derek, what year was this?
This would have been in 2018.
Cool. That's important. Thanks.
Yeah. So in 2018, I was looking at this. I ran the survey in 2019 and again, didn't find the expected from the literature effect of Latino identity. Instead, I found that policy was actually driving a lot of the forces. But in that study, I only included abortion and immigration. And they both essentially showed that on the Democratic side, there was a lot of support for more liberal policies on both issues. Same with on the Republican side. And then independents, I saw very little movement. And so this then inspired me, and I have to be very thankful to my advisor, Tolly Mendelberg, who just kept on saying kitchen table issues, bread and butter. And across 3 subsequent studies that I ran over the ensuing 3 years, I essentially consistently found that Latino Democrats are Democrats, Latino Republicans are Republicans, and Latino independents vote for whoever talks about the economy.
See, I should be getting an honorary doctorate from Princeton, because this is what I've been telling Chuck for 25 years now. So, Chuck, any thoughts, initial reactions to this?
I don't trust none of you academics. I trust none of y'all. I don't give a damn. But I do find this interesting, Derek. I think that there's a through line to what you're saying in this research to what you've talked about. I wrote about it in T.O. Bernie. I talk about on TV every day now about why Latinos now are supporting Donald Trump at a higher number, is that Donald Trump 20 years ago with the exact same message of just 3 core things, which was drain the swamp, no to NAFTA, and stop investing in foreign wars, would have been a reason for me to vote for Donald Trump 20 years ago as a non-college educated brown guy growing up in East Texas. So I think that you're on to something. I think there's lots of conversations happening in DC. Tell us about backing up and your thesis and your to this point of running this experiment. What took you to that point? Was there things that happened? Was it your frustration with politics? Was it academia? Was it this advisor?
So the advisor was the person who gave me the sort of backbone to do this, because in a way I was going up against many very prominent people in the literature who I have a lot of respect for, and many of them are cited in my article. And so that's sort of a tightrope I had to walk, was to make sure that I'm still giving respect to people who genuinely did pave the way, while still being clear that, especially in 2016, particularly in 2020, and again in 2024, we're seeing strategies being enacted towards Latino voters that are not shifting aggregate Latino voting behavior. And so even regardless of my own personal commitments and political views, it was clear that Latino voters were not responding in the way that a lot of these theories would predict. And so as an academic, and also as somebody who wants to give Latinos a better shake, and ultimately as somebody who believes that voters know their interests, I fully reject anything that says that Latino voters don't know their interests one way or another. Mm-hmm. Latino Republicans, for example, do express racially conservative views on abortion. They're oftentimes anti-undocumented. Many of them fled socialist regimes. They tend to be more affluent. And I think even that can sometimes be overstated. In general, I think that Latino voters, as Mike says in his book, are aspirational voters. And in many ways, I think that the Democratic Party has overly applied a framework that works for Latino Democrats. And to be clear, it does work for Latino Democrats, and that's still at least a majority of the population. But it fails to engage Latino voters who have remained on the partisan sidelines in a way that economics has a greater effect. And at least in 2020 and 2024, I would say that the Republicans were perceived as having greater ownership over the economy, just generically as an issue. And we'll get into how that manifests in my specific findings. I am not persuaded that this is a hugely ideological thing. I think it's much more about just simply people want the government and the economy to be doing things that help them. If they are not feeling like the economy is working for people like them, if they feel like the government doesn't represent their interests, they're going to vote against the incumbent. And so that happened in 2020. It's going to happen again, probably in 2028. It happened in 2024. And so in many ways, I actually think that Latino voters are more rational in a way because they are responding to how these conditions are developing. In short, they're saying, well, if the economy isn't improving, we need a change. And again, I think there's different data, different ways to slice it. The overall economic growth indicators might say one thing, but at least whenever we're talking, and I'm seeing a lot of these focus groups and just generally the distributions of wealth, working class and middle class Americans in general are suffering, and Latinos especially have suffered, have not benefited from a lot of this post-COVID economic growth. Latino workers were also oftentimes on the front lines during COVID. And so another reason for why a lot of Latino voters may have voted for Trump is that he was saying, let's reopen the economy. And these are workers who, unlike myself, didn't have the luxury to work from home.
Man, we gotta have you on more.
This is going to be horrible.
Yeah. Look, and I'm going to be real candid and direct here too. I was very publicly and still am very publicly critical of a lot of those academics that you respect, because I don't respect them, because the anecdotal evidence was compounding for many, many years. It was evident in campaigns, and I think this is one of the reasons why I had so many problems with certain academics who were driving this narrative, which was quantifiably false, like in the real world.
Can you recap for our listeners which one of the theses that you're saying was incorrect leading into this? Which one of them you're talking? Not the person, but the theory.
What I'm arguing is essentially what Derek was saying, and what Derek is saying is that the strategies that Democratic campaigns have been using work for Democratic voters. But as you see Latinos becoming the fastest growing segment of the independent, no party preference, unaffiliated, and a rightward shift, basic math says you better change your strategy or you're going to keep losing Latino voters.
That makes sense.
And that's what's been going on nationally, at least for the better part of a decade. California was a little bit of an outlier, but it began in earnest essentially in 2022. And we get into why those reasons are. But it is troubling when I see academics saying, using this academic literature for Democrats, essentially. Like they're basically imposing this Democratic view of the world and saying this is the way Latino voters think. And it is rare. And again, this is Mike Madrid saying this, Derek, so you're not going to get in trouble. Everyone knows I'm the crazy one here.
Absolutely.
What Derek is saying now is that it does work for Democrats. It doesn't work for Republicans, certainly, and it's not working for independents. It also, I think, goes to the point, and Derek pushed back if what I'm saying is wrong. What Republicans are doing is really only working because of the economic and demographic transformation. It's not an ideological shift. They're not becoming more conservative. They're becoming less partisan broadly. And as that happens, and as Republicans lean into populism and Latinos become more populist, Republicans are winning votes despite their best efforts, not because of them, is essentially the argument that I'm making. And is that what you would say is right or wrong?
And Derek, you should feel free to tell him he's wrong.
Please do, because Chuck does all the
time. Sorry, Chuck. No, that is consistent with the findings of my study, which like the Republican pro-business messages are not as effective as a Republican just generically talking about jobs. Republican messages that are moderate on economics are generally slightly more positive than a Democrat doing so. But again, I tend to think of that as that Democrats are already sorted, while there's some Latinos who are hearing Republicans. And I have other research showing that Republicans are not shy about sharing a lot of their anti-undocumented views, even towards areas with large numbers of Latinos. But by the same token, they're also engaging in a large amount of Latino identity rhetoric. And so one might say that Republicans are both having their cake and eating it too.
Right.
And it's, again, and looking at aggregate outcomes at a lot of these majority Latino areas, that strategy does appear to be working more so than a lot of Democratic strategies. And again, I have another paper that I sent along that's currently a preprint. So it's not fully, it's under review. So hopefully it'll be out soon. And what this shows is that the number of Latino Republicans has actually remained fairly stable for the last 3 decades. There's a lot of compositional shift. Older Latinos and those who are US born became more Republican. And actually Latino immigrants in 2008 to 2012 went towards Obama. But post-Trump, Latino immigrants are going strongly Republican. There's been about a 5 to 7 point shift between 2016 to 2022 in terms of identity. And so, and again, these are by definition legal citizens. Many of them do not feel affinity towards undocumented immigrants. And again, far be it from me to judge an individual who had to wait for 15 years. Again, it's a complicated issue and I want to be careful to stay just with the data and not get too much into my own views.
It's also not just specific to Latinos, by the way. That's immigrants broadly. At least according to the New York Times study that was done after the 2020 cycle.
Yeah, I mean, the trends are even stronger among Asian and even Black immigrants. So African immigrants are much less democratic than African Americans, and there's great research on that. So democratic identity has dropped, just a secular drop across groups ever since Obama. And the biggest winner among Latino voters in the last decade is independent, small I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, that's just gave a presentation to a business community organization yesterday, going over that dynamic. In California, we do track party registration, and so it's not just self-reported; it's actual hard data. And the declines of Democratic registration in the most Latino Assembly, Senate, congressional districts has like fallen off of a cliff over the last couple of years. Now, most of it's going to independent, but Latinos are the fastest growing group of independents in the country. And again, the data is not saying that Latinos are becoming more conservative, but there's a lot of data saying Latinos are becoming more populist and they're rejecting both parties. And that's why I think I'm as hopeful as you are, Derek, is saying that's the premise basically of my book, which is this is the hope for stabilizing a system that has gotten so partisan that it's now gone off the rails. Is you've got Latinos that are rejecting both. That's promising. That's actually helpful. One of the downsides is I believe that's one of the reasons why it's manifested in lower voter turnout. And that's not a good thing, obviously. But it's because when no party appeals to you and no party is doing the hard work to actually understand you, and both parties are regressing to their orthodoxy and motivating their own base, what happens to Latinos when most of us are, not most of us, but the largest number of any group of us are leaving both parties altogether, is you end up with this wide swath of Latino voters who are saying, this is all just a bunch of game. This is ridiculous. This is a racket. None of this is speaking to what I believe in. No one's talking about the basic core issues that matter to me. And as an aspirational economic voter, by definition, we're less reactionary to all the cultural bullshit that's going on both sides of the party system. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would agree. What I can specifically say from my findings is that while partisanship is the biggest driver among Democrats and Republicans, I don't interpret that to say that immigration doesn't matter, but more to say that, again, these partisans have already sorted. So Latino Democrats are certainly those who believe strongly in racial justice and immigrant rights. Latino Republicans are very frequently those who were opposed to Black Lives Matter, are anti-socialist, and do not support undocumented immigrants. And so I don't necessarily think that a racial identity framework is theoretically, I think it theoretically applies to these groups pretty effectively, actually, just like it applies to partisans overall. But again, I think Latino independents are even unique in the sense that even compared to white and Black independents, they're more likely to support bootstrap ideology. So they believe that America is a land of opportunity, but they also support a higher social safety net. And so in many ways, Latinos, if they become a more influential group, could have this moderating effect.
Right.
And I think that that's, to me, the positive aspect of this, which is that, again, if Latino voters are looking at the state of the country and voting on that basis, that's actually better than voting just purely based on party line.
And so with your research, and we've talked about some of it here, and as we're moving through this conversation today, what are some of your other findings that you wanted to highlight that you have found in some of this research that you've done?
So in my dissertation, I look at television ads and specifically examine differences in how campaigns mention the topics of economics and the topic of immigration. And then what I do is I plot it based on the percent of Latino in a given media market. And what I find is that across years, Democrats are significantly more likely to talk about immigration in areas with more Latinos. Republicans are equally likely across the board. So again, Republicans are not hiding their anti-immigrant messaging from Latinos. On the other hand, when you plot economics, in some years for Democrats, the relationship is actually negative. So in areas with fewer Latinos, Democrats are talking about the economy quite a bit. In areas of more Latinos, they're actually less likely to do so. On the other hand, for Republicans in 2020, the relationship is positive. So in 2020, Republicans were more likely to talk about the economy if a given media market had more Latinos. which again means that Republicans are talking about economic issues towards Latino voters, which, based on my experimental research, should lead towards greater Republican support among Latino voters overall.
Again, nailed it in a nutshell. Basically, what you're seeing is where there are large numbers of Latino voters, Democrats will go in and talk immigration, even though that is weakening as Latinos become more independent. Republicans aren't shying away from that issue, saying we'll take our 35, 36% of that on the other side. But when the Republicans start communicating, they're talking about the jobs and the economy. And that's what they're leaning into, which is what the data is overwhelmingly saying is what Latinos want to hear. Is that right?
Yeah. I draw a lot of inspiration from Pew Research Center polls, which I think has been the gold standard for a lot of these types of arguments. And 2016 is one year where immigration was very high salience and was on the top list of issues among Latinos for obvious reasons, with Trump and with Hillary Clinton making it such a big part of her campaign. But ever since that year, immigration is consistently in the middle of Latino issue opinions. It's actually lower than among white Republicans. White Republicans care a lot about immigration. Overall, Latinos are consistently favoring, and you can look across polls, jobs, inflation, healthcare, education. Those are always consistently the top issues, with other issues such as gun violence, police reform, Black Lives Matter coming up as they become higher in salience, but they never stay at the top. Whereas those economic and service-oriented topics are always at the top of Latino issue polls.
And have been for decades, by the way. One of the anomalous things about 2016 is that was really that was like when the Rubicon was crossed between the highest numbers of foreign-born Latino registrants and the explosion of U.S.-born Latino registrants turning 18, which is why I argue that a lot of this has to do with people who have a weaker ethnic anchor and a weaker affiliation with the immigrant experience. You point out quite accurately, it's a lot of people that waited 15 years in line that are immigrants themselves that are the ones that are the most saying, hey, all of these people who are here undocumented, who are skipping lines, no, crack down on them, send them back. I waited, you go wait. I went through this long, laborious process. And like you said, I think you phrased it very well. It's not yours to judge. It's just, it is as a scientist to look at the data and say, well, what's it telling us? And that's what it's telling us. We can debate the morality of it, but we got to listen to it at a certain point.
Definitely agree.
So where's this all heading? Can I ask that question? Where do you see this going? Is assimilation a bad word? Is it not assimilation? Do these attitudes change over the next 5, 10, 15 years? What are you seeing? Where's this going? Where are these trends taking us?
Specific terms like assimilation, acculturation, they have sort of academic meanings attached to them that I don't want to necessarily dive into. What I'll say more explicitly is that Latinos are more and more Americans. And I think that has its own whole bevy of complicated aspects. That's not denying the existence of racial inequality. But I think that a lot of Latinos are essentially saying, stop treating me as this other group, treat me as an American. So even beyond any like specific theoretical or ideological framing, to me, that is the clearest way to explain it, which is that, again, Latinos want to be successful, to provide opportunity for themselves and their children. Whenever racism and xenophobia stops that, we see Latinos coming out in droves to fight back. But
2018 is a good example of that.
Exactly. So there's certainly still mobilization. And I think that with a lot of Donald Trump's deportation policies, we have seen extensive mobilization among Latinos and their allies. However, for Latinos who are either, again, more distant from the immigration experience for a number of reasons, more just able to pass in many different ways, or even just simply are successful in America. And I think that a lot of people would say, stop roping me into this chaotic politics. I came here to do better for myself and for my families. I also think that even when we talk about immigration as a political issue, and we inherently and then theoretically in academic circles view it as a racial issue, firstly, immigration is inherently a discussion about labor market flows. and about differential economic opportunity levels in different countries, whether you're leaving your country of origin, which basically nobody wants to do. You know, people like me who move a lot are weird. Nobody really wants to leave El Salvador, but they do so because, like, for example, with climate change, you literally can't work from 12 to 2 during certain, like, you'll die. With everything happening with regards to crime and instability, you know, you can't know that your children are going to have opportunities. And so, again, the decision to immigrate, I would argue, is inherently one about economic opportunity and economic circumstances. Many of the debates about immigration in the United States hinge on how immigrants are or are not impacting the labor supply. So again, I think there's almost a false bifurcation of economics versus race. I tend to believe that they're inextricably linked. And the issue of immigration, again, is ultimately one about who should be able to come into this country and work and contribute to this vast and amazing country that I still believe strongly in its ideals. And in that way, I also think that when campaigns are treating different groups in different ways, I don't blame people for tuning them out. While on the other hand, if you're just talking to people as Americans, as people who, again, want to do better by themselves and their children, I think that you're able to reach a broader group than just people who are on either side of the partisan aisle.
Yeah, I've been thinking while you and Mike have been geeking out on all y'all's professorial things and talking about the big words, is about these messages actually reaching people. That, you know, you live in a world of data. Mike lives in a world of where he's really smart. And then I live in a world of reality. And the reality that I see in a lot of campaigns is that the way we target and reach voters is so inefficient and doesn't work well enough to where they actually get to hear an opposing argument. I like the research the most of where you just looked at where the money was spent and on what messages and in what market. It leads back to the Chuck Rocha saying of no peso, no say so. And if you're not spending money there, then don't blow smoke up my skirt and tell me that, you know, you think I'm cute, because that ain't working.
Exactly.
Show me where you're spending your money. And when I go into campaigns, and Mike knows this, is that they're looking for efficiencies. How can I get and talk to the most voters who are going to go vote? Well, when you have this demographic that's so much younger than regular folks, who are consuming in 2 different languages, who are living in multi-generational houses, who have old people like me that are old and crippled and watching news in an old reclining chair every evening, and then younger folks who don't own a TV, who are consuming gaming and consuming all this other, is to reach them. And what I found is that in politics, we have this thing, for you, and Mike knows this, is that a persuasion score and a turnout score kind of, they take care of all of the analytics that we need. We just need to know what percentage of this person, the likelihood of they're Democrat or Republican, and then we cut off both ends of that and try to talk to people just in the middle. And that's not bad science. And it's way closer with white people because they have a landline, they have a mortgage, and they have a truck. So you can kind of find them. Unlike Derek, who moves around all the time, it's hard to find you, right? Like most young Latinos. And then you look at a turnout score, and this is the key. When the average age of your demographic's in its high 20s, and the average age of the general public's in its 40s that are voting, it just doesn't match apples to apples. So I've been trying to figure out, taking the things that you're saying, the thing that Mike's saying, of saying, how do we turn this around? Sure, we need to talk about the economy more. We need to talk about immigration less. We need to take on Donald Trump and show what he's really doing to our communities that are hurting families. I understand that. But it's fixing the broken political consultant infrastructure or consortium that still run everything the same way. And I don't mean in any way are they bad people or that it's a bad strategy. I'm just saying it doesn't fit neatly with Latino voters. And we're going to continue to lose when you have somebody who is so starved for attention like Donald Trump, who just consumes so much space and time. When I'm trying to make the alternative argument of Democrats are with the workers and Republicans are with the bosses and all the things, and then looking back at your data, I'm trying to figure out nowadays of like a better way to reach them, because you, Mike, everybody now is in agreement. We got to talk more about the economy. We got to tell what we're going to do to help people. But it's like My next round of research is going to be like, how do you break through in this clutter and then have a message? The message, I'm not one of these academics who think the messages are going to some silver lining message. I think folks just never get to hear from the fucking parties. And to Mike's point, Republicans win despite themselves because they're not the Democrats and they're at least showing that they're tough about whatever. I may disagree with them, right? Mike, do you have anything to add on that piece of what I was saying?
No, I mean, that's a struggle for both parties, right, in this splintered media world. But I do think that, let's talk about Kamala Harris real specifically in this last campaign, who did pivot and realize Mike Madrid was right and moved over to all my issues that I was saying she should have done. But no one was believing her. And the reason why is because the Democrats for 15, 20 years have been messaging in the opposite direction. That's going to take time. That's going to take time to fix and repair all the damage that has been done. And the belief that Latinos are all, first generation Spanish exclusive, working in industries that are, relegated to the immigrant. That's not the experience of the vast majority of Latinos. And that's what Democrats have been conveying. That's my opinion. I think there's a lot of evidence to back that up. And I think the results back that up. I am interested, Derek, one other question, though. How is your work being viewed in the academy? How are other academics seeing your work? What are they saying?
Great question.
So actually, I first want to circle back to what Chuck's saying, asking about how do we translate these, and this is my goal in a lot of ways, and that's why I'm on this podcast today is, and this will also segue to your question, Mike. Mm-hmm. I navigated the academic dynamics of this with the ultimate goal of going to campaigns and talking to them. So actually, as I make my dissertation a book project, the real meat and potatoes of that is going to be in 26 and 28. I'm going to conduct interviews with campaigns, ask them these questions. Again, I'll be talking to you all about that. Mm-hmm. And the ultimate goal there is just to see if we can shift and build a Latino electorate. So the simple answer I can give is that campaigns, especially the Democratic Party, have been derelict in their duty when it comes to building an electorate. There's this whole academic argument that we have a very weak party system compared to, for example, European democracies. And in a lot of ways, I think that, and I'm not going to say that what was happening in the 1900s was a positive thing. There was a lot of racial exclusion, and the ways that Polish and Irish immigrants were included was explicitly about keeping Black voters out. Mm-hmm. But there was an effort to have immigrants brought into the Democratic Party directly by providing economic benefits to them. And again, that patronage system had a lot of issues, but there was an effort. There was a recognition by the parties that you have to be showing up not just every 4 years. And this is the most common critique I hear about Democrats is that they're gone for 4 years. They show up, they say, hola, have a breakfast taco. Hopefully don't say that it's as diverse as the Latino community, but oftentimes they do. Mm-hmm. And then they're gone. And guess who's showing up to the asadas on the weekends? Guess who's going to Cinco de Mayo and, 16 y 15 de septiembre? Republicans. They're showing up, they're shaking hands, and they are by and large, especially in the Rio Grande Valley and Florida, they're more present than Democratic operatives. And so I think going even more back, Latinos are neither turnout nor persuasion voters. They actually have to fall in love before they even decide to enter the electorate. And I think this is something that Bernie Sanders really, really hit. And honestly, Donald Trump as well. He made sure to just send a message. Both of them sent messages in ways that were not modulating their opinions. They weren't changing their tone just because they were talking to Latinos. And I think that ultimately that's the single best advice I can give to any campaign is that firstly, Latino voters have not been reached out to enough. So it will cost more money. Dollar for dollar, this will not be efficient for a single election. However, if you ignore this, you are essentially just leaving so many voters by the wayside. And again, I think Republicans have acknowledged this and have engaged in building out their Latino electorate more so than Democrats have. Democrats also tend to rely on third parties. And this is a consistent issue. I really love the work that groups like Unidos US and Voto Latino do. Democrats overly rely on them. They don't build out their own resources to reach Latino voters. And so, yeah, I'll also talk about the academic aspect of this. I've received pushback essentially from the jump. I still remember whenever I presented a poster and I received a decent amount of support, but because I was a little graduate student, essentially I was told, oh, we don't believe these results. You don't find an effect where we expect to find it. And then the coefficients for the policy were so big that they were unbelievable. But then I ran 3 more survey experiments and I found essentially the same, like almost visually the same results. Again, where Latino Democrats support Democrats, Latino Republicans support Republicans, and that's regardless of policy. So regardless of what policy areas are mentioned, these are loyal partisans. But then Latino Independents would support whoever talked about the economy. And I think that part of the issue is that with the academic publishing process, and frankly, with the way that Latino politics has not always been given enough respect in the discipline. And that's why I personally, even though I disagree with many of these scholars, I have nothing but respect and admiration for what they've been doing for the last 2 decades, if not longer, to create a space for people like me. And so again, I want to be really, really clear that while I disagree, I could not be doing this work without pathbreakers like those people. However, that does also mean that there is a group of people in academia who oftentimes are not necessarily incorporating these new arguments as quickly in a way that I think needs to represent what is happening on the ground. And I also think that I'm just in some ways the one who had the stars align, both with Trump getting elected, with Latinos shifting in this way, having run my experiments at the time that I did, slightly before this started showing up on the New York Times every week. And again, that's another reason why I'm on this podcast, is that I have done the academic research to test these sort of folk wisdom theories. And based on my studies, which is encapsulating over 2,500 Latino voters collected over a 4-year time period, I consistently find these results and I can stand by them and say, academically, Dr. Derek Wakefield, this research has consistently shown these things. And so it's not just something that pollsters are showing. It's not a one-off. This is a replicated experiment done multiple times in multiple different ways, finding the same thing. Again, Latino partisans are sorted. Latino independents care about the economy.
Well, Dr. Derek Wakefield, me and Mike Madrid, and I'll speak for Mike here, I'm bigger than him, will want to back up your research and help give you and grow this, right? Like, I think that there's things that me and Mike can do that can help you and have access to other numbers and other things and numbers. Mike's probably laughing. I know I can see him laughing, but the numbers part he can handle. But like the other parts of the real life implementations, I can't say that right. I don't like to get beyond 2 syllables. But when we talk about this work, you're talking about, when you talk about Unidos or Voto Latino, and this ain't Chuck Rocha jumping in to protect my clients, but this is something that's been a spur under my saddle for a moment, is that I don't think we're over-reliant, and I can prove that we're not over-reliant on these groups because they're not getting any money to spend. And if you look at the money that's spent just based off of pure science that you did, if you look at these ads that are run in these districts, none of them are run by these 2 people. And they're doing very little field work. So we are waiting, and we can get into this on another podcast, but we're relying on well-intentioned white consultants who are working for the Democratic Party at some ever level of whatever that is. Mostly it's at the campaigns because, to be honest, the DCCC and the House Majority PAC have woken up to the theory that you're talking about and started winning back seats in California 27 and 13 and New York 4 and all these places, because your research has led them, research like yours, to do things differently over the last couple of cycles. And now it's bearing fruit. What worries me, to your point about falling in love, is that there's not a lot of money going into the infrastructure in the communities for Democratic groups or parties. Because I was on the phone this morning, Mike Madrid, let's just say with a congressman from the Valley. I don't want to tell people who I was talking to, but we talk about him all the time. He was saying how he's frustrated and he's worried that when he leaves, another Democrat will never win that. But the one thing he said is that Republicans are down there year round working in these communities, to your point, Derek, and that we don't have something like that. And then on top of that, our polling is not polling as well as it can. And he's really worried. And I've been saying that I want to talk to him. And I actually brought up Mike Madrid to him this morning and said, look, me and Mike would like to help you if there's ways that we can help you, because we're thinking outside the box. But I'd love to continue this conversation and talk about, what's the next steps with your work, monitor your work. And I think it's really cool. And I'm going to kick it over to Mike before we close out about, it's not lost on me that Dr. Derek Wakefield is a Latino who's going to be at Bucknell University. He can tell you about all the kind of professioning he's going to be doing there. That's not my strong suit. But when me and Mike talk about our parents, our grandparents, and immigrants who are coming here and doing good work. I think that we at this podcast, we in this community want to highlight people like Dr. Derek and think about people that are really doing groundbreaking stuff who don't. Just like me and Mike used to not get any credit because we were the Mexicans in the room and we were told to go get in the corner and maybe run some field on the weekends. But like other researchers like Dr. Derek, and I'm going to keep saying that because I love the name of that, and say it loud so people can understand that. I'm proud of what you're doing and I'm happy that you're here. And I'll kick it over to Mike for his final thoughts before I close this out.
Well, to listening to both of you guys, obviously voices I respect and will increasingly come to respect. I'm trying to walk through my own journey here. And again, when I was making the decision in the early 90s whether to go into the academy and study this, or whether I just wanted to go out and actually do campaigns and see it, materialize on the ground. It's why I moved back to California, is I knew that's where most of these races would be through the course of my career, and I'm happy with that move. What you're doing is groundbreaking, Doctor, and I think you're probably aware of that. That's why I asked the question about the academy, and I'm glad that you have a respect for that. It means you were raised right. Maybe I wasn't. Because what I'm going to say, I'm going to be clear about this, I think these academics have done a huge disservice to this country by putting out really bad, quantifiably wrong research. And I will stand on that. And I've been saying it for 10 years. It has created an exacerbation between the stereotype of who these people are trying to say we are as a community, as opposed to leaning into it and honoring the diversity of our Latinidad broadly, generationally, economically, education levels. I think it has been very destructive in terms of polarizing and injecting this polarized element into our political system when it needed it the least. And it has quantifiably been wrong in the last 3 national elections where Donald Trump has won increasing shares of the Latino vote. And yet these same people will continue to deny that it is happening. So I'm not too sure whether it's incompetence or whether it's malicious, but it's one of those two. And again, you are a better person than I am for fighting the fight in the academy. I chose not to go that route because I could kind of see that there. And I was like, I'd rather just go prove out the model in the real world. I'm grateful I did because I've been successful in that. And I've been saying a lot of what we've been discussing today, which is why I wanted to have you on the show. But what I am far more focused on now is empowering voices like yours, especially when what you're saying is clearly playing out, to say we need to do better at, not just as a political system, we need to do better in the academy, we need to do better in the media, and we need to do better in our political systems and our political parties in understanding that the Latino is not just this siloed individual where you can just dump a bunch of money and messaging on immigration and be very anti the other party and think that that's what is healthy for our community, because it has not been healthy for our community. It's been very damaging to our community, and I'm just grateful we're resilient enough as a people to move on and move forward. So on that
Dr.
happy note, I'll let you take us out, Chuck.
And before I take us out, Dr. Wakefield, our group that we have like 15 people that listen to this podcast, but they are very important 15 people. So you want to give us your final thoughts, and then I'll take us out because we're really honored to have you here. We'll have you on more, and anything you have for our listeners. I like the parts when you talk about how smart I am and pretty over Mike, but you can take us out any way you want.
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave on a positive note, which is a reflection on what Mike is saying, which is to say that I really just think that viewing Latinos as Americans, especially Latino voters, I think that perspective is a very simple way to challenge a lot of these, what I call essentializing narratives. I know that's a big word, but the idea here is that Latino identity and Latinidad is not a destiny. It is a question. And I think that every individual Latino person has their own way of navigating that. And so in my research, I try to understand that and to, again, give respect to people to say that they understand their own political views better than I ever can. They know themselves more than any academic will. My job as an academic is to scale that to thousands, millions of people, and to try to understand trends in that. But while I'm doing that work, I have to make sure that I'm giving respect to the views of people, to listen to them, and to accurately represent their views, especially if I disagree with them. And so that's my big motivator here, is that I hope that Latinos can help us move towards a democracy where, again, we disagree, but we do so in ways that we agree on the overall goal, which is to make America better, is to provide opportunity, is to ensure that we are not having such high rates of death from preventable diseases, that we don't have these massive disparities in health outcomes, in educational and economic outcomes, and that we no longer, hopefully, sometime in the future, can address these issues of racial discrimination and xenophobia, because this country was built by immigrants. And what I can say there is that I am confident that this will pass. These growing pains are a consistent story of America. And I generally think that the average American does not view Latinos as a threat. They instead just want everybody to be Americans, to build this country together. And so I'm going to be talking especially to campaigns to try to drive that point home. But even beyond the political, I'm really excited as a professor to be mentoring really, really smart students, and especially to make sure that Latino and Latina students who maybe are not considering academia as an option. And so, Mike, I will be pushing, and I already have one at Emory who is applying to PhD programs. So I'm really, really excited. Even if none of my research ever has an impact, I also am incredibly happy to be a mentor and to help support Latinas and Latinos in the academy as well.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Derek Wakefield, thanks for being on the Latino Vote podcast this week. For you being on it has made us better at what we're doing. And this is exactly the reason we did this. We want to thank everybody for listening this week. We want to thank everybody who's been calling us, emailing us, giving us information. We're going to continue to do this every week. And I think Dr. Derek Wakefield's another good example of folks who we want to lift up their voices and let them be heard. Don't forget to like us. Don't forget to recommend us. Don't forget to give reviews. And I promise next week we're going to get away from all this academia. And for all of you who tune in for fishing and hunting reports, we're going to get back to that next week, talk about fun things. Not that academia ain't fun, but Mike Madrid takes up all the time when we talk about smart people. And Dr. Derek, thank you again for coming. And until next week, call your mama.